What if I told you that some of the things we call myths actually turned out to be real? Researchers are uncovering lost cities that were dismissed as fiction for centuries. Historians are proving the existence of creatures once thought to be nothing more than fairy tales. Some legends became truth not because history changed, but because the evidence finally caught up. For centuries, people dismissed incredible stories as mere fantasy. But science and archaeology have proven that some of them were surprisingly accurate. From lost civilizations to mysterious technologies, the world has preserved the truth better than our textbooks. Reality has proven to be bolder than any legend. Today we're breaking down 30 historical myths that turned out to be terrifyingly real. Unicorns, underground cities, deadly weapons, lost empires, and vanished peoples. These aren't just stories, they are pages of history. And the greatest screenwriter in this story is reality itself. The unicorn was real, but it wasn't the creature you remember from childhood stories. The historical unicorn was the Elasmotherium, a massive, shaggy rhinoceros that could weigh up to 4 tons and sported a colossal horn right in the middle of its forehead. It was a prehistoric tank, not a magical pony. For centuries, tales of one-horned beasts were dismissed as tall tales until paleontologists found fossils confirming their existence. Yes, unicorns existed, but they weren't the graceful creatures you'd want on a t-shirt. They were multi-ton survival machines, capable of plowing through anything in their path. If you met one in real life, you wouldn't be thinking about magic. You'd be thinking about how to run away as fast as possible. Their existence is a reminder that nature creates creatures more amazing and terrifying than any fiction. The legend of the, quote, poison damsels of India sounds like a spy movie plot, but it has real historical roots. Vishakanyas was the name given to young girls who were allegedly raised on microdoses of poison from childhood until their bodies became lethal, even to the touch. According to legend, a single kiss from such a girl could kill a king. For a long time, this was considered folklore, a warning about dangerous beauty. But texts from the Maurya Empire confirm that these girls were actually used as biological weapons during political intrigues. The Vishakanyas weren't just a myth about femme fatales. They were tools of political assassination. They were raised in royal courts under strict control over their diet and toxin intake. These women were never used in open combat. Their purpose was far more dangerous: to infiltrate the circles of rulers and generals and eliminate them without a single sword or arrow. Historians suggest this was the most terrifying form of weaponry because it worked where all other methods failed. The Kraken is a legendary sea monster, said to be able to drag a ship to the bottom with one tug of its giant tentacles. For centuries, sailors told stories of a beast the size of an island emerging from the depths to snap masts and crush hulls. This was long considered the exaggeration of sailors who had seen too many storms and drunk too much rum. But reality turned out to be just as impressive. The real Kraken was the giant squid, capable of growing up to 40 feet long. With eyes the size of dinner plates and tentacles that could tear through a wooden hull, this deep-sea giant was more than enough to inspire the most bone-chilling legends. Imagine yourself as a 15th century sailor. Dark night, storming skies, a raging ocean. Suddenly, something massive, slimy, and shadow-like emerges from the abyss. Its tentacles reach for the deck, the water boils, and the ship creaks under the pressure. It's no wonder that after such an encounter, people told stories of monsters that could turn the world upside down. Legends weren't born of fear alone, but from real encounters with creatures that seemed incomprehensible. The giant squid wasn't a myth. It was living proof that the ocean hides more than we can imagine. Brain surgery in the Stone Age sounds like a horrific fantasy, but it was a real medical practice called trepanation. Stone Age people would drill or cut a hole into the skull using flint tools, and, amazingly, many patients survived. Archaeologists have found skulls with clear signs of bone healing, proving these people lived for years after the procedure. Trepanation was used to treat head injuries, epilepsy, or to, quote, drive out evil spirits. Despite the primitive tools, this was one of the first known forms of neurosurgery, both gruesome and awe-inspiring. The very idea that Stone Age people could successfully perform brain surgery seems impossible. Yet their technique was surprisingly precise. They avoided critical areas of the skull, removed bone layer by layer, and controlled the depth of the cut. Dozens of skulls have been found with fully healed edges around the holes, a clear sign of a long life post-op. This discovery changes our view of ancient humans. They weren't savages, but observant, brave, and technically skilled. Their neurosurgery is proof that human intelligence is impressive in any era. Female gladiators sound like something out of a movie, but they are a historical fact. In 2000, archaeologists in London discovered the grave of a woman buried with the same honors as celebrated gladiators: pottery with combat scenes, offerings, and ritual items. Ancient Roman art and inscriptions confirm that women entered the Colosseum with shields, swords, and helmets to fight each other, or wild beasts. These weren't just opening acts, they were real fighters, as trained and dangerous as their male counterparts. Roman history hid them for centuries, but archaeology has restored the truth. Roman society was brutal, but also incredibly spectacle-driven. Female gladiators were an arena sensation. They impressed the crowds with their strength, skill, and courage. Their battles were no less bloody than the men's, and some sources suggest that certain emperors staged women's matches specifically to shock and amaze the public. Imagine the massive Colosseum, the roar of the crowd, the baking sun, the smell of dust and metal, and two women stepping out to fight, knowing the chances of survival were slim. This isn't a myth. It's a real part of the Roman Empire that was ignored for far too long. The story of Moby Dick isn't just a novelist's invention. At the heart of the legend was a real albino sperm whale named Moby Dick, the terror of the Pacific Ocean in the 19th century. He was enormous, rare due to his white coloring, and extraordinarily aggressive. Unlike other whales that fled from whaling ships, Moby Dick would turn and attack. According to sailor accounts, he survived dozens of harpoons, smashed boats to splinters, and became a true nightmare for a generation of whalers. This invincible titan of the sea is what inspired Herman Melville to write his novel about a hunt that turns into an obsession. Moby Dick wasn't just an animal, he was a living myth. A whale that consciously went into battle, ramming wooden ships and flipping them over, became a symbol of oceanic defiance. To whalers, he was an unbeatable nightmare. To a writer, he was the embodiment of the ocean's raw power. Picture the scene: a pale giant lunging from the churning water, boats flying into the air, and men realizing for the first time that in this fight, they are the prey. That is why Moby Dick entered the maritime chronicles as one of the most famous real monsters of the ocean. Caligula was infamous for his erratic behavior, but one of the most unbelievable stories involved his floating palaces. For centuries, these were dismissed as exaggerations or satires of a mad emperor. However, in the 1920s, when Lake Nemi was partially drained, archaeologists stumbled upon two massive ships, larger and more luxurious than most Roman buildings. They featured marble floors, mosaics, and even complex plumbing systems with hot and cold running water. These weren't just ships, they were true floating estates, designed for imperial banquets and extravagant entertainment. The discovery of Caligula's ships was a massive archaeological shock. No one expected that Romans could build such sophisticated structures, ships with heating, water systems, and decor that could outshine the emperor's land-based palaces. They proved the sheer scale of Caligula's luxury and his obsessive spending. These were floating islands of decadence where the emperor hosted legendary banquets. A story many thought was fiction turned out to be a stunningly real testament to absolute power and excess. The story of the Pied Piper of Hamelin sounds like a dark fairy tale. A musician leads all the rats out of town, the mayor refuses to pay, and in revenge, the piper takes all the children. For centuries, this was viewed as a moral parable. But in Hamelin, Germany, city chronicles from the 13th century record a real event. In the year 1284, 130 children vanished from the city. Not rats, not a magical evil, children. The official record states they were led away by a man in multicolored clothes and never returned. The cause of the tragedy remains a mystery. Modern historians have several theories. The children might have died in an epidemic, been sold as labor, joined a failed children's crusade, or even emigrated to distant lands. But the core fact remains: the event was real, and it left a deep trauma in the city's history. The fairy tale hid a true tragedy, a mass disappearance of the youth. Hamelin still honors this mystery today, and ancient stained glass windows depict not rats, but the children, the real victims of the mysterious event that birthed one of Europe's darkest legends. It sounds impossible, but at the highest point on Earth, the summit of Mount Everest, you can find marine fossils. It seems absurd. How did the remains of ocean creatures end up at nearly 29,000 feet? For a long time, people refused to believe it until geology explained the phenomenon. The rocks of the Himalayas were once the ocean floor. Millions of years ago, the Indian tectonic plate collided with Eurasia, with such force that the seabed was thrust into the sky, gradually forming the mountain range. The roof of the world was once the bottom of the sea. On the rocks of Everest, you can see the imprints of ancient corals, mollusks, and other sea creatures that lived millions of years ago in the deep. These fossils are some of the most striking evidence of how plate tectonics works, a force capable of lifting the ocean to the heavens. Imagine a climber standing on the roof of the world with the history of a prehistoric sea right under their boots. It's a reminder that even the planet's highest peak was once part of the bottomless blue. Imagine trying to describe a gorilla to someone in the 18th century, a massive, hairy, incredibly strong beast that roams the jungle and beats its chest. It's no wonder that for over 2,000 years the Western world viewed them as nothing more than myths, right alongside dragons and griffins. Ancient travelers wrote of wild men of the woods, but their accounts were dismissed as tall tales. It wasn't until the 1840s that scientists finally obtained a skull and later a live specimen, confirming that these mythical monsters were real and even more majestic than anyone expected. For centuries, gorillas existed in a state of semi-legend, featured on maps alongside monsters and described in fearful whispers by explorers. But when 19th century scientists finally encountered them, they realized these creatures were not only real but highly intelligent, social, and strikingly similar to us. It turned out that the planet's largest primate was the living confirmation of a centuries-old myth, a creature people were afraid to imagine, yet one that had always walked alongside human history, hidden only by the thick tropical shadows. The legend of Archimedes' death ray sounds like science fiction. Supposedly, the great mathematician created a system of mirrors that focused sunlight so intensely it set Roman ships on fire from a distance. For a long time, this was dismissed as propaganda or ancient exaggeration. But modern experiments, including tests by a team from MIT, have shown that with the right geometry, weather conditions, and dozens of polished bronze mirrors, it is actually possible. A ship's wooden surface can begin to smolder after just a few minutes of concentrated reflected light. While we can't say for certain if Archimedes actually used this beam in combat, the scientific basis of the legend is unexpectedly real. Setting ships ablaze could have been possible, which makes the story even more fascinating. It's not magic or a fictional invention. It's physics that was way ahead of its time. The myth of the ray weapon became an example of how ancient civilizations could use simple materials to create technologies we long thought were impossible. The Amazons are one of the most famous legends of Greek mythology, a nation of warrior women who allegedly rejected tradition and matched the strength of male heroes. This was long considered a pure myth, a symbolic story about the other created by the Greeks, but archaeology has provided a sensational correction. In Scythian burial mounds across the Eurasian steppes, female remains have been found buried with weapons, swords, bows, spears, and even armor. Many of their bones show combat injuries, the same kind found on male warriors. These discoveries proved that the Amazons weren't just a fantasy. It was a real social phenomenon. Among Scythian tribes, women actually fought alongside men, were skilled horsemen, and master archers. The Greeks, stunned by this lifestyle, so different from their own, turned them into the legendary, quote, warrior women. But the foundation of the legend was entirely real. The Amazons existed, they just weren't a mythical nation, but part of a culture where bravery determined status, not gender. Sea serpents have long been the stars of terrifying legends. Giant creatures like undulating shadows in the dark ocean, rising from the depths to haunt sailors. On ancient maps, They were drawn as monsters capable of capsizing ships. It seemed like fiction, born of storms, darkness, and sailors' fear. But the reality turned out to be far more interesting. Often, the sea serpent was a very real, though extremely strange-looking creature, the oarfish. It is the longest bony fish in the world, capable of reaching lengths of over 36 feet. Oarfish occasionally rise to the surface when they are ill, or when underwater seismic activity occurs. Their wave-like movements, the red crest along their bodies, and their immense length make them look strikingly like legendary sea monsters. Imagine being a 16th century sailor, seeing this shimmering silvery creature coiling under your boat at night. The legends don't seem so exaggerated anymore. The ocean's real monster turned out to be just as bizarre and majestic as its mythical counterpart. To Europeans of the 18th and 19th centuries, stories of a tiny people living deep in Africa sounded like fairy tales, something akin to gnomes or mythical forest spirits. They were dismissed as folklore, travelers' exaggerations, or colonial fantasies. But long before that, over 4,000 years ago, the ancient Egyptians were well aware of the pygmies' existence. One of the clearest pieces of evidence is a letter from the young pharaoh Pepi II, dated around 2270 BCE. In it, he commands an expedition leader to take great care of a pygmy dancer being brought from Central Africa, promising a massive reward for his safe arrival. The Egyptians held the pygmies in high regard, viewing them as divine dancers and symbols of good fortune. They even depicted them in temples and maintained active trade contacts with the regions where these people lived. So what was considered a myth in Europe for centuries was a documented reality for ancient Egypt. The pygmies weren't magical creatures. They were part of intercultural connections that existed long before Europeans even began exploring the African interior. The Antikythera mechanism is a case where history literally forces us to rethink our understanding of ancient technology. For centuries, it was believed that complex gears and mechanical computing devices didn't appear until the Middle Ages, or even later. But in 1901, a corroded, unremarkable piece of bronze was recovered from a shipwreck near the Greek island of Antikythera. It took decades to realize that hidden inside was a complex system of over 30 interlocking gears, a mechanism that could predict the movements of the sun, moon, planets, and even the dates of future Olympic Games. Modern X-rays and 3D scans have revealed the true genius of this device. It was an analog computer that predated its era by a millennium. The engineering precision of the mechanism is so staggering that humanity produced nothing like it for another 1,000 years. The Antikythera mechanism proves that ancient civilizations possessed knowledge and technology we long undervalued, and that lost technologies are sometimes more real than myths. The word assassin is associated with video games today. Hooded shadows quietly taking out their enemies. But the real history of the assassins is even more fascinating and much more terrifying. They were the Order of the Nizari Ismailis, operating in the medieval Middle East. They didn't maintain large armies. Instead, they mastered the art of precision political assassination. Their fortresses, including the legendary Alamut, were nearly impregnable. The Fidai, elite warrior killers, operated in broad daylight, often consciously sacrificing themselves to complete their mission. Many legends about drugged-out warriors and hashish were exaggerations or propaganda from enemies looking to demonize the order. In reality, the assassins were disciplined, sober, and highly motivated. They eliminated caliphs, viziers, and crusaders by weaponizing the psychological effect of fear. Even their reputation was a tool. Their methods influenced the politics of entire empires, and the myth of the secret cult of killers lives on to this day. The Nazca lines, massive drawings of hummingbirds, spiders, monkeys, and mysterious figures etched into the Peruvian desert. Because they could only be fully seen from high above, it was long believed they were made by aliens or ancient civilizations with supernatural powers. But the truth is much simpler, and, at the same time, more impressive. The Nazca people created these geoglyphs by removing the dark, iron oxide-coated stones to reveal the lighter soil underneath. It was a massive, but technically straightforward, landscape project done by hand. The biggest mystery isn't how they were made, but why. They may have served as astronomical calendars, ritual pathways, or the largest art installation in history. Despite decades of research, there is no single answer. But one thing is certain: it didn't take space-age technology, just the collective labor, imagination, and incredible organization of the Nazca civilization. Atlantis, the legendary island nation that supposedly vanished beneath the waves in a single day. For centuries, this story seemed like a purely philosophical myth from Plato, a fictional allegory about pride and the fall of civilizations. But more and more research suggests that the legend might have been based on a real catastrophe: the volcanic eruption on the island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, around 1600 BCE. It was one of the most powerful volcanic events in human history, literally tearing the island apart and triggering massive tsunamis. The catastrophe wiped out the advanced Minoan civilization centered on Crete. The sudden collapse of a powerful island culture destroyed by the sea bears a striking resemblance to Plato's description of Atlantis: ruined settlements, vanished ports, submerged coastlines. All of this could have been passed down through generations as the legend of the, quote, island that fell into the sea. Atlantis, the most famous myth of ancient history, was likely not a fantasy, but a memory of a real apocalypse. The Shang dynasty was long considered a myth, much like the reality of King Arthur was questioned in Europe. They were only known from texts written centuries later, and no archaeological evidence existed. That changed in the late 19th century when Chinese pharmacists began selling dragon bones as a medicinal powder. A scholar happened to notice symbols carved into these bones, and it became a sensation. This was the oldest form of Chinese writing, etched onto turtle shells and ox shoulder blades. These dragon bones turned out to be oracle bones from the Shang dynasty. Over 3,000 years ago, kings used them to record major events, queries to oracles, and dynastic lineages. Everything matched the mythical stories from ancient texts perfectly. Thus, a dynasty dismissed as legend suddenly gained undeniable archaeological proof. In a twist of fate, their history was literally being ground up in mortars and pestles to be turned into medicine before it was saved. The Trojan War seemed like a legend for centuries, mostly because its main characters were semi-mythical figures, like Achilles, Hector, and Odysseus. Because of this, many historians believed the city of Troy itself was a Homeric invention, a beautiful setting for an epic poem. But everything changed in the 1870s when Heinrich Schliemann, inspired by the Iliad, began excavations in Turkey. Beneath layers of earth, he found not one, but several successive levels of cities, and one of them had been destroyed by a violent war, exactly during the period described by Homer. Troy turned out to be a real city with a world of fortresses, gates, and wealthy buildings. While the Trojan horse was likely a literary device, the fact that a powerful city was destroyed during a great war is undeniable. Fire, weapons, shattered fortifications, archaeology confirmed what seemed like a myth. The legend of Troy was simply a poetic reimagining of real events that changed the course of history. For centuries, the Great Pyramid of Giza has been surrounded by rumors of secret chambers, hidden passageways, and unknown vaults of knowledge. For a long time, scientists believed all internal spaces had been explored, a few corridors, the burial chamber, and nothing more. But in 2017, thanks to muon tomography, a technology that uses cosmic particles to X-ray massive structures, researchers discovered a massive void inside the pyramid, at least 100 feet long, located directly above the Grand Gallery. This discovery was a sensation. A structure studied for millennia was still hiding a massive space whose purpose remains unknown. It could be an unfinished chamber, a technical corridor, or a part of the construction yet to be revealed. The existence of such a large secret void proves that even the most well-studied ancient monuments still hold their mysteries. The Great Pyramid continues to surprise humanity just as much as it did 4,500 years ago. The biblical story of Sodom and Gomorrah was viewed for centuries as a symbol of sin and divine punishment. The rain of fire and brimstone that destroyed the two cities seemed like an allegory rather than a description of a real event. But archaeologists investigating a site called Tal el-Hammam in Jordan discovered the ruins of a thriving Bronze Age city that was instantly obliterated about 3,600 years ago. The signs of destruction don't resemble an earthquake or a volcano, pottery melted into glass, buildings leveled to the ground, and the topsoil showing traces of extreme heating. Researchers suggest the city was destroyed by a cosmic airburst, a meteor that exploded in the atmosphere with the power of thousands of atomic bombs. Such a strike could instantly vaporize buildings, set everything ablaze, and even evaporate the water in the Jordan River. This aligns perfectly with the biblical description of fire from the heavens. If this theory is correct, Sodom and Gomorrah weren't myths. They were a catastrophe that witnesses tried to explain using the language of their time. The myth turned out to be an echo of a real apocalypse. Viking sagas spoke for centuries about a mysterious land called Vinland, a green, fertile country far to the west, across the sea. Many historians dismissed these tales as exaggerations or fictions created for heroic legends. After all, the idea that Vikings reached America 500 years before Columbus seemed unbelievable. But in the 1960s, Norwegian explorers Helge and Anne Stein Ingstad found the remains of a settlement in Lonso Meadows, Canada, longhouses with sod walls, iron nails, and other artifacts characteristic of Norse culture. The find proved that Vikings indeed set foot on North American soil long before the European expeditions of the Renaissance. They built homes, smelted iron, and lived in the territory for a period before leaving the settlement. The site was abandoned, but the legend of Vinland lived on in the sagas, and only 1,000 years later did archaeology confirm its authenticity. What was once considered a tall tale turned out to be a real chapter of world history. The story of a lost Roman legion in China sounds like a Hollywood script. After the defeat at Carrhae in 53 BCE, thousands of Roman soldiers were supposedly not killed but captured by the Parthians. Legend has it they were sent further east to serve as mercenaries on the borders, were captured again, this time by the Chinese, and eventually settled in a remote desert area called Liqian. For a long time this was pure speculation. However, Chinese records from that period describe the capture of warriors who used a fish scale formation, an almost perfect description of the Roman testudo, tortoise formation. Further discoveries made the story even more mysterious. Genetic testing of Liqian residents showed an unusually high percentage of Caucasian ancestry, which is atypical for the region. While not definitive proof, it supports the hypothesis that some legionnaires might have actually settled there and created a mixed community. If true, these Roman soldiers traveled thousands of miles and became part of Chinese history, an incredible journey for an army that supposedly vanished without a trace in the desert. Legends of the White City, the lost city of the monkey god, tantalized explorers and adventurers for centuries. Hidden in the jungles of Honduras, a whole civilization was supposedly tucked away behind high mountains and thick tropical canopy. Many considered it a myth, a tropical version of El Dorado. But in 2012, a team of researchers used LiDAR technology, capable of seeing through the jungle. Beneath the forest floor, they discovered clear outlines of plazas, pyramids, roads, and canals, an entire city buried by nature for over half a millennium. When a ground expedition reached the site, the legend was finally confirmed. Amidst the jungle, they found stone statues, artifacts, ritual seats, and the remains of structures. Most striking was a stone throne carved with a human jaguar figure, likely the inspiration for the monkey god legend. The city had been swallowed by nature for over 500 years, but remained remarkably well preserved. Thus, the myth turned out to be a true story of a lost culture, returned to humanity by modern technology. Thonis Heracleion, the ancient gateway to Egypt, was such a wealthy and influential city that even Herodotus wrote about it. But over time, it disappeared so completely that scholars decided it was either a myth or a confusion by ancient authors. No traces of the city could be found on land, and local legends only hinted at a city the sea took away. It wasn't until the year 2000 that French archaeologist Franck Godillot, exploring the Bay of Aboukir, discovered what was thought to be a fiction under 30 feet of water and silt. The ruins of a massive sunken city with temples, statues, residential quarters, and docks. Among the sunken structures were colossal statues of pharaohs, gold jewelry, sacred barks, and hundreds of artifacts that were surprisingly well preserved. The city wasn't destroyed by an enemy. It was slowly swallowed by the elements due to soil liquefaction and earthquakes. It turned out the legend of the Egyptian Pompeii was absolutely real. A once mighty trading hub lay at the bottom of the sea, waiting for science to rediscover it. The submerged Heraklion turned myth into documented history. El Dorado, a word that drove men mad for centuries. Conquistadors imagined a vast city where streets were paved with gold and temples shone like the sun. But the true origin of this myth is much more fascinating. The Muisca people of modern-day Colombia had a unique ritual for crowning a new ruler. His body would be covered entirely in gold dust, turning him into the Gilded Man, literally El Dorado. He would then board a sacred raft and travel to the center of Lake Guatavita, where he would wash the gold into the water as an offering to the gods. During the ceremony, the chief's subjects would throw gold jewelry, masks, bowls, and precious stones into the lake. Spaniards who witnessed this were so astounded that they returned home with stories of an entire city made of gold. Thus, a ritual that was a symbol of spiritual purity and renewal turned into a legend that pushed hundreds of expeditions to search for a non-existent civilization. In reality, El Dorado was never a city. It was a man, shining with gold on a sacred lake. During the Vietnam War, American soldiers often told stories of an enemy that could appear out of thin air and vanish just as quickly. It seemed as if the Viet Cong were ghosts, shadows that could walk through the earth. To those unfamiliar with the terrain, it sounded like an exaggeration or a combat myth born of jungle paranoia. But the truth was much more literal and much more terrifying. Beneath the soldiers' feet lay an entire underground state, the Cu Chi tunnels, one of the most massive subterranean systems in the history of warfare. The Cu Chi tunnels stretch for more than 120 miles, forming a complex network of living quarters, hospitals, weapon caches, kitchens, command centers, and booby traps. The Viet Cong lived, fought, and moved underground, literally beneath the boots of American troops. This is where the myth of jungle ghosts came from. The enemy truly could disappear into the ground in a matter of seconds. It wasn't a myth, it was a brilliant execution of subterranean warfare that became a key factor in making the Viet Cong nearly elusive. The story of Captain Kidd is the ultimate archetype of pirate legend. A famous privateer turned pirate, he allegedly buried a massive treasure before his execution and left behind mysterious maps that inspired adventurers for 3 centuries. This became the foundation for hundreds of novels, movies, and childhood stories about treasure islands. Most people dismissed it as fiction, a romantic myth with no real evidence to back it up. But the truth is just as striking. Kidd's treasure actually existed. It was just found almost immediately. Before heading to New York to try and clear his name, he stopped at Gardiner's Island off the coast of Long Island and gave the island's owner chests of gold, silver, and precious fabrics for safekeeping. After Kidd's execution, the authorities forced the return of this hoard. So the legend was true. The treasure was real, but no one had to search for it for centuries. It was seized right away. This sounds like social media clickbait, but it's the absolute truth. An ancestor of the famous actor Mads Mikkelsen was a real Danish pirate. His direct relative, Mindert Nordstrand, operated in the 15th century in the Baltic Sea and was such a menace that he was a major headache for merchants and the Danish crown. He commanded his own ship, raided vessels, and evaded punishment for a long time. Eventually, the pirate was captured and put on trial, and that's where his story became even more dramatic. So the next time you see Mads Mikkelsen playing a charismatic villain, remember, that dark charisma might just be a legacy from a real sea rogue passed down through the centuries. History sometimes keeps surprises that no screenwriter could ever invent. The myth that Napoleon was short has persisted in our culture for 200 years. Caricatures portrayed him as a tiny, aggressive Corsican dwarf, overcompensating for his height with wars of conquest. The idea took such deep root that it became part of popular psychology, giving us the term Napoleon complex. But this information is nothing more than political propaganda. In reality, Napoleon was of perfectly average height for his time, about 5 feet 6 inches or 5 feet 7 inches, 168 to 170 centimeters. The confusion stemmed from the difference between French and British inches, combined with the British press mocking him by depicting him as small. In reality, in many portraits, he appears taller than many of his staff officers. The myth didn't arise from facts, but from propaganda and satire that outlived the man himself. School textbooks often repeated a beautiful but completely false claim that people in the Middle Ages believed the earth was flat. This myth was used to paint that era as dark and ignorant, creating an unihoc. Medieval universities taught the works of Aristotle and Ptolemy, where the earth's shape was described as a globe. The myth of the flat earth of the Middle Ages didn't actually appear until the 19th century. It was invented by writers who wanted to frame past centuries as an age of total darkness. It wasn't history, it was a convenient caricature that proved to be surprisingly resilient. The myth that medieval people were filthy and rarely bathed has long been a staple of pop culture. Movies and cartoons depict residents of that era covered in layers of grime, as if hygiene were a foreign concept. But this is an exaggeration that doesn't fit reality. Many European cities had public bathhouses, bathing was a common social practice, and people used soap made from animal fat and ash. While their hygiene standards were far from modern, they still understood the necessity of washing their bodies, hands, and faces. It was only during plague epidemics that people began to avoid bathhouses, believing that hot water opened the pores and made one more vulnerable to disease. The myth of the dirty Middle Ages arose much later, mostly through literature and art that exaggerated reality for dramatic effect.